There are three ways of assigning probability. The classical probability and empirical probability are objective approaches, while the subjective concept of probability is, as it sounds, subjective. The subjective approach involves personal judgment, information, intuition, and other subjective evaluation criteria used by the individual in assigning a probability to an event occurring. It's not based on any precise computation, but it is often a reasonable assessment by a knowledgeable person. The classical approach is a probability based on the symmetry of games of chance or similar situations. The probabilities are based on the idea that certain occurrences are equally likely. A good example of the classical approach is the six-sided die tossing experiment. Empirical or relative frequency is the second type of objective probability. It is based on the number of times an event occurs as a proportion of a known number of trials. Classical probability is based on the assumption that all outcomes are equally likely to occur. The probability of an event occurring is computed by dividing the number of favorable outcomes, or outcomes we're trying to observe, by the total number of possible outcomes. In the example is illustrated on this slide, if a die is rolled once, we want to know what's the probability of observing an even number. In this experiment, 6 possible outcomes can be observed, but of the 6, only 3 are even numbers. So the probability of observing an even number is 3 out of 6, or 0.5, 50%. We talked about mutually exclusive in Chapter 2. Events are mutually exclusive if the occurrence of any one event means that none of the others can occur at the same time. So an example of this would be a coin toss. You couldn't have heads and tails at the same time. If an experiment has a set of events that includes every possible outcome, such as the events an even number or an odd number in the die tossing experiment, then the set of events is collectively exhaustive. For the die tossing experiment, every outcome will either be even or odd, so the set is collectively exhaustive. Events are independent if the occurrence of one event does not affect the occurrence of another. So if we roll a die and we get 1, rolling the die again doesn't mean that we won't get 1 again or we'll get another number. We can also say that events are independent if the occurrence of one of the events gives us no information about whether or not the other event or events will occur. So if we roll an even number, it doesn't tell us anything about what the future numbers could be that we would roll. Empirical probability, which is also known as relative frequency approach, is the second type of objective probability. It's based on counting the frequency of observed outcomes x in relation to the number of trials n. It's therefore based on the outcome of an experiment. For example, we could estimate the reliability of a barcode scanner by counting the number of missed scans and dividing it by the number of items scanned. Empirical estimation is useful when we have no prior knowledge of events. The law of large numbers basically states that over a large number of trials, the empirical probability of an event will approach its true probability. So the more that you go through and roll the die, if you're trying to get the probability of getting an even number, the more rolls that you do, the closer you will be to getting its true probability. When we rely on estimating a probability based on an individual's assessment, we have what's known as subjective probability. Subjective probabilities are usually used when there is little or no past experience or information on which we can base a probability. So some examples of subjective probabilities are estimating the likelihood that the Cleveland Indians will win the 2014 World Series, determining the likelihood that a student in a statistics class will receive an A grade, and estimating the likelihood that the Dow Jones Industrial Average will break 15,000 in 2014. So now let's take a look at the summary of types of probability. This slide summarizes the different approaches to probability, grouping the approaches as objective and subjective. The classical probability and the empirical or relative probability are the objective ways of estimating probabilities, and the subjective probability is based on available information.